Hey everybody, we're back and we're sending Kerbals to Moon. Of course, safety first. This is the KS-101 building of the escape tower. So you can kind of see how I'm doing that. I'm using clipping to sort of save space and make it look a little nicer. And then I have this nice little trick for adding a parachute inside of the nose cone, because otherwise we couldn't put the tower on. Of course, it never works the first time. Needs a little fine tuning of the amount of fuel, the thrust, and also the time when you decide to launch the parachute. Just a few adjustments to the engine, and we have to make sure that we deploy the parachute at the top of the trajectory. This will give it enough time to fully open and enough time for the vehicle to slow down. We also want to test it on top of a moving test vehicle, just to make sure the crew will make it out alive in real life situations. All right, now we're ready to create the actual capsule of the Kerbollo space program. To design the vehicle, I made a few calculations, basically just conservation of energy, looking at the change in energy required to reach a new orbit. And from the delta V, we can do some calculations to figure out how much fuel we would actually need in each stage. The crew will mostly be in the command service module, which is a small craft that'll be used to orbit Moon and for the return trip. So the cargo bay has a few of the necessary equipment, including antennas and RCS fuel. We want the stage to be lightweight to reduce the load for the other stages. The Kerbollo 4 is an unmanned launch designed to test the Katurn V launch system. The first stage contains 5 rockets, which is designed to bring the spacecraft through the thicker parts of the atmosphere. Stage 2 deploys at around 15 kilometers, which is designed to carry the spacecraft almost to a circular orbit. That way, when the first 2 stages are ditched, they fall back to Kerbin. Then the third stage, the S4B, is a smaller rocket designed to complete the burn into a circular orbit and to perform a home and transfer to Moon. The Kerbollo 4 is also meant to test the re-entry system. However, when the command service module was deployed, the SAS system detached. So they had to open up the bay doors and remove the SAS. Even with less control, they were able to continue with the test. So they launched into a higher orbit to simulate re-entry. The re-entry was a little shaky at first, but with the aerodynamics it was able to stabilize. The heat shield also worked fine. Next up in the Kerbollo program is Kerbollo 5, which was meant to test the landing module and its engines. It burns into a circular orbit to perform the tests, deploys the command service module, and then using accelerometers, it's able to test the acceleration of each of the engines. They call the ascent stage test the fire in the hole test, since it detaches and fires at the same time. When the test is done, it burns up in re-entry. Now that we have all of our stages tested, we're ready to perform a test of the emergency abort system. Yeah, we totally meant to do that. Those are just fake stages planted with explosives. And it seems to be working fine. So now that that's over with, we're going to test a launch to a free return trajectory around Moon. Again, this is an unmanned launch, but we're testing each of the stages in full capacity. Our goal is to perform a free return trajectory. That way, in case anything goes wrong, before getting into Moon's orbit, the Kerbals can make it back safely to Kerbin with only a few correction burns. Basically, you're performing a gravity assist, but instead of launching outwards, you're launching back to Kerbin. Because they didn't need to test the command service module, they added a test version, also called a boilerplate, but the engineers forgot to add the updated SAS, and it burned up on re-entry. Despite that mistake, a few brave Kerbals agreed to hop on board for the first manned test. The launch stages performed nicely. Once they reached space, Don Keyseal took over the command module. Stage 2 brings the spacecraft into a nearly circular orbit, performing a burn in the horizontal direction, and then the S4B stage completes the burn. For now, the Kerbinauts are going to stay in Kerbal orbit and test the procedure for extracting the lunar module. Of course, it's not the real landing module, just a docking port attached to the S4B stage. After they detach, they turn the craft around, dock with the landing module, and bring it with them on their transfer to Mun. You can check out one of my previous videos that explains how I use the nav ball to perform docking, which I think is one of the easiest methods in the game. So check it out if you're having any trouble with that. In Kerbollo 8, they perform the free return trajectory test, but this time with Kerbals on board. Frank Corman is the pilot during launch. They get some nice whole cam video of the stages deploying. Stage 2 brings the craft to a large suborbital trajectory. Then the S4B stage deploys and completes the burn, also performing inclination corrections to line up with Mun's orbit. James Covell takes over for the transfer burn, so they rendezvous with Mun using a free return trajectory and happen to get a close approach with one of the communication satellites. The transfer takes about 1 day. You can see that they rendezvous near Apoapsis, perform a correction burn to save some fuel, making better use of the Oberth effect. While they wait for the closest approach, they look out their window and become the first Kerbals to get a close look at Mun's surface. And at periapsis, perform a burn to go into Mun orbit. The parking orbit will be at around 14-kilometer altitude. So they get some nice footage of their trip around Mun, including their classic shot of the Kerbin rise. After a few orbits, they're ready to return back to Kerbin, so they increase the apoapsis until they go into an orbit around Kerbin, and they want their periapsis to be somewhere in the atmosphere, so they make use of the air resistance to slow their craft down. With the raised stakes of having live Kerbals on board, the engineers definitely had their fingers crossed, as did the crew. Once they bled off enough speed, they were able to open the parachutes, but there was a bit of error in the landing destination, so they ended up on the side of a mountain. The key was to come down slowly with the parachutes. Luckily, they landed without tumbling down. These mountains were actually right next to the KSC, so their aim actually wasn't too bad. Next up is Kerbollo 9 with another landing module test, this time testing the controls and final design. After docking, the landing module pilot performs an EVA to transfer over to the landing module. While still attached, they test the descent module engine. Then they perform the fire in the hole test with the ascent module. Next, they undock the landing module, and then they do a mock rendezvous and docking with the command service module. When the tests are finished, the landing module pilot returns to the command service module. They ditch the landing module in orbit and begin re-entry back to Kerbin. The re-entry and landing went smoothly. The parachute opens and slows down the craft, and again they happen to land close to the Kerbal Space Center. The final mission in this video is the full dress rehearsal of the manned moon landing. The only thing that this doesn't include is the landing itself. Everything else will be tested as if it's the full real mission. During this test, they do a dress rehearsal of communication between ground and spacecraft, and they also observe the fuel levels to see if they need to adjust the fuel for the real mission. The command service module successfully docks with the landing module on its route to Mun. One issue is that the S4B stage doesn't have enough fuel to complete the transmunar injection burn. They reach a free return trajectory, get a nice close approach to Mun. They reach a circular orbit, needing a few extra corrections. Eugene Cernan performs an EVA to transfer to the landing module. They actually didn't include enough fuel for him to perform the landing, just in case he got a little too excited. So he goes into a smaller orbit around Mun and waits in that orbit until they can rendezvous with the command service module, transfer remaining fuel because they're running a little too low on fuel, and then they burn to go into an orbit around Kerbin. They say goodbye to Mun, perform the re-entry, and splash down safely in Kerbin's ocean. So from that last test, they realized they needed to perform a few more adjustments on the fuel. The Kerbal Space Center will train the Kerbollo 11 crew for the first manned landing on Moon. So stay tuned for that video coming out next. See ya!